child.
Tried to sacrifice me, but I ran away from there.
Because I am a great father, but I'm sleeping with...
Why did one of music's biggest moguls adopt a white girl? The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as she took the stand, ready to reveal secrets that could potentially destroy his empire. What began as a mysterious adoption story is now unraveling into a web of allegations, exposing shocking motivations behind the decision. As the proceedings unfold, the world is finally hearing her side of the story, and you won't believe what she had to say about those infamous parties.
My name's Ava. I'm a Scorpio.
No. What's your last name?
Oh, Ava Combs.
What's your other last name?
Ava Baroni.
Eva Baroni Combs. Diddy adopted a white child. I want you to tell them the story about how I adopted you. But you still have beautiful parents.
And he saw me and decided to pick me up and said to come inside and play with his kids.
Yeah.
Diddy presented me in front of his friends. I was very scared. He tried to sacrifice me, but I ran away from there.
What is a freak off? The freak off essentially was something that Cassie said she learned about through Sean Combs about a year into their relationship. He described it as voyeurism.
He had everything to do with what she was wearing. She said she would buy outfits from sex shops and see which one he wanted her to wear. And then inside the actual hotel rooms, their apartments where the freak-offs took place, she said that Combs was in charge of lighting. It began with candles. It then moved to studio lighting.
They might say she's lying, but that's going to be a little hard to do with that.
The story begins far from mansions and private jets, in the quiet suburban life of a young girl who couldn't have been more removed from Diddy's lavish world. Her name, which remained largely unknown at the time, soon became the center of whispered intrigue when her path crossed with one of the most influential figures in music. At first, she was just another face in the crowd, young, quiet, and seemingly ordinary. But the circumstances that brought her into Diddy's orbit would later ignite heated debates about power, privilege, and hidden motivations. It was at an exclusive event, one that catered to the elite, where she first caught his attention. Accounts vary on how exactly this interaction occurred. Some say she was working behind the scenes, assisting a lesser-known name in the industry. Others suggest she had simply been invited as a guest, blending into the background among the glitz and glamour. What stood out, however, was how quickly she became an object of curiosity. People close to the event noticed how she repeatedly found herself in quiet corners of conversation with Diddy, maintaining a calm and reserved demeanor in stark contrast to those loudly vying for his attention. It wasn't just that she seemed out of place, it was the way she so effortlessly captured his interest in a room full of more obvious candidates.
Step to the side, please.
You guys smiling? Are you guys feeling? How do you feel today?
Step to the side, please.
Watch out. Watch your back.
Big great. How can you bother today? Congratulations at NYU, Chad. Give us a little space. Give us a little space. Give us a little space. Golden Nation.
Nice to look you smile. Nice. Is that
Step to the side, please.
you look like this guy being by his very stuff? Yeah.
Wait.
Keep us a little space. Watch out. Give us a little space, please.
All right,
Sorry about that. It's fine. Give us a little space.
Here. Oh,
Chuck it in, guys. Guys.
oh. Boss down down. When you're behind, he's burning it.
Back up. Sorry, back up.
I just played that white was right out of here. It's also conduct.
Hey, man, Sean, man, be good, bro.
What made this budding connection so startling was the contrast of worlds. She represented none of the excess Diddy surrounded himself with, no celebrity lineage, no high-profile social presence, no dramatic style to make her stand out. Old interviews from unnamed event organizers and insiders often described her as vulnerable, a word that seemed to explain both her presence among the powerful and why someone like Diddy might single her out. But even then, no one could have foreseen what happened next, her life being completely upended by a legal adoption. When Diddy announced the adoption, it immediately raised eyebrows. For someone so deeply embedded in a media world that thrives on optics and image, the lack of explanation was confounding. He framed his decision as a gesture of care, citing personal convictions and a desire to provide her with better opportunities. But a decision of this magnitude, adopting a young white girl into a world of intense celebrity scrutiny, was never going to fly under the radar. If anything, it only invited more questions. Why her? Why now? These were inquiries Diddy seemed to deliberately sidestep, which only fueled growing speculation. Rumors began swirling almost instantly. Some media outlets hinted that his interest in her stemmed from guilt tied to someone in her past. Other theories suggested the adoption was a PR move, an attempt to soften his image at a time when he needed to remain relevant. But one story, often whispered among insiders, involved her innocence. She was said to be a living contrast to Diddy's reputation for extravagance and hedonism. There was an unsettling suggestion that her very presence, her stark difference from the fame-saturated world around her, wasn't a shield from it, but a lie. Public conversations, however, were consistently drowned out by Diddy's insistence that it was nothing more than an act of altruism. He had the means, he argued, and she needed the chance, a new path that only someone like him could provide. Yet the gap between his explanation and the reality of their unlikely connection continued to raise doubts. And as more layers of the story were peeled back, the adoption began to look less like a noble act of kindness and more like the setup to a mystery far darker than anyone had imagined.
But it was more than that. It was how Cassie took that stand. You could hear a pin drop when those doors opened, and a visibly pregnant Cassie Ventura walking past a man she had not seen in 6.5 years. A man she says violently abused her for a decade. A man the prosecution said trafficked her. Well, she sat across from him, placed her overcoat behind her, turning her body slightly toward the jury, rubbing her pregnant belly throughout her testimony. Diddy, well, he was more fidgety than he was the day before. He was passing notes. He pushed himself away from the defense table and largely sat like that. They never seemed to make eye contact with one another, not even after she was crying about having loved him once and planning and participating in these freak-off sex parties because she feared him and she wanted to make him happy, but feeling worthless, feeling disgusting because she didn't want to do it. Now, with each moment, the testimony became more and more graphic. Her delivery, though, it never changed. It was matter of fact, steady, calm. At times, she was even critical of herself, walking us all through how a 10-album record deal came over a 10-year period of abuse and sexual humiliation.
Is he running an entertainment and fashion industry, or is he running essentially a criminal organization?
By the way, we have a poll up right now. You can participate in it. Do you think Cassie Ventura was a victim or partner in this? Ready for this? 82%. Well, this doesn't make sense. 82% say yes. I don't know if that's yes to. I think we need clarification. 82% say victim or partner. We'll get a clarification on that.
By the way,
right now.
But that's my answer to that question.
Oh, okay. 82% say victim. 82% say victim. Maybe based on we're reporting on the testimony right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think she is a victim if the allegations are true, but also she is involved in some of the criminal act. I mean, she's getting those prostitutes, right? She's making payments to them, allegedly. She's having them come. So she's involved in some of the alleged criminal activity. And that's an interesting point that wouldn't just apply to her. Other people in his orbit might be some combination of victim and co-conspirator.
But you know what? That video changes everything, because the argument would be, what do you think happens if she says no?
Yeah.
What do you think happens if she says, I'm not in the mood for a freak off tonight. I'm not going to pay the dancer. That's what's going to happen. That video is arguably the most important piece of evidence because it sets the stage when we're talking about coercion or force. Question from Angelina. How old was Cassie when they first started dating? I think she was 19 years old. So you're talking about a 17-year age difference. That's important. I think that's an important factor if you're talking about power and control, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that he's older and obviously has much more power anyway.
Sherry Williams asks, what kind of time is Diddy facing if he's found guilty?
The announcement came with little warning. Sean Diddy Combs, a man known for his larger-than-life presence in music, fashion, and business, revealed to the world that he had adopted a teenage girl. She seemed entirely removed from the empire he had spent decades building. In interviews and public statements, Diddy framed the decision with a sense of purpose. He referred to her upbringing as difficult and claimed he simply wanted to give her a better life. But even as he projected compassion, the abruptness of the announcement left many questioning how a girl from such a drastically different world had suddenly become his daughter. At first glance, the adoption appeared almost random. She wasn't a known associate, had no public ties to Diddy, and no shared story had ever been mentioned before. There were no prior photos, no social media breadcrumbs, no industry whispers leading up to this reveal. Diddy's explanation was vague at best. He asked the media to respect her privacy and spoke only in broad, emotionally charged terms about offering her new opportunities. But the lack of detail only fueled more speculation. Why had this young girl, who looked more like the stranger next door than a new member of hip-hop royalty, been taken in under such mysterious circumstances? Public reaction was swift and sharply divided. Some praised Diddy for what they saw as an act of generosity, a rare glimpse into a more human side of the mogul. Others, however, were more skeptical. They labeled the move performative, strategic, possibly even manipulative. Media outlets seized on the gaps in the story, digging into the timeline and legal process behind the adoption. Articles surfaced suggesting the process had been unusually fast-tracked, with whispers of favors and influence behind the scenes. Legal experts chimed in, pointing out that high-profile adoptions are typically slow and highly scrutinized, especially when there appears to be no prior relationship. Behind closed doors, the whispers grew louder. Industry insiders and those claiming knowledge of Diddy's inner circle began floating darker theories. They commented on how this girl's presence felt jarringly out of sync with everything that usually surrounded Diddy. No glitz, no connections, no ambition for fame. Unlike others who had gravitated toward him for access, opportunity, or spotlight, she seemed to have none of those intentions. And that, insiders said, was precisely what made the situation so strange. Speculation bubbled. Was this about redemption? Control? Or something far more complicated than Diddy was willing to admit? Still, Diddy maintained his public stance. He told anyone who would listen that it was about guidance, helping a young girl escape a troubled past and offering her a better future. On the surface, the words were noble. But beneath them, a growing unease lingered. The media kept digging, unable to find satisfying answers about the adoption's timing, its speed, or its true motivation. Each carefully vague response only deepened the mystery. If his reasons were as simple and selfless as he claimed, why didn't they hold up under scrutiny? And more importantly, was there something about this adoption that even Diddy himself didn't want to face? The revelations to come would suggest this wasn't simply an act of kindness. It was the opening move in a story tied to his private life in ways no one could have expected.
Important death needs to be looked into.
I think that Al being his ex-wife, he have every right, knowing about the stuff that came out about Diddy and what he was doing. You understand what he has done in the past, and people have overlooked it. By him coming out and saying that he hoped that he could get her case reopened. There was a guy called John the Paperwork Party. They would put in an open petition to get Kim's case reopened. You understand what I'm saying? So I'll be sure doing this is showing that, he still got love for Quincy's mother. He still want to find out the truth because allegedly Kim was fine the day before and the day of her death. And then now she found in the bed dead from pneumonia. That just don't sound right, bro. That don't sound right at all.
So you feel the same way about her death being suspect?
I don't think nobody in America thinks nothing suspicious about Kim's death, bro. If you are rich like that, you could, Kim had, I think a net worth of like, $12 million a year or something like that. Kim could have called any doctor to come over and look at her. If she was that bad, she could have called an ambulance or something like that. Everything is suspicious about her death, bro. And I don't think an autopsy was done on her. And if it was a half job.
You personally, right? What do you think happened to Kim Porter?
If I say something personal, bro, and my belief.
Rumors about Diddy's infamous freak-off parties had swirled for years, spoken about in hushed tones and only vaguely alluded to in the media. These events, known for their exclusivity and secrecy, were said to attract some of the biggest names in entertainment, politics, and business. On the surface, they were elite gatherings, a celebration of success, power, and indulgence. But the details of what allegedly occurred behind closed doors were far less glamorous. Whispers of excess, troubling power dynamics, and unsettling behavior clung to these parties like a shadow. For a long time, it was all dismissed as typical industry gossip, the kind of salacious talk that inevitably follows someone of Diddy's stature. But as the girl's story began to unfold, those whispers became harder to ignore. Accounts from individuals who claimed to have attended painted a disturbing picture. Former associates and staff described environments carefully constructed to impress and intimidate. Lavish mansions transformed into temporary playgrounds for the elite, complete with gourmet catering, live performances, and meticulously vetted guest lists. But beyond the spectacle, it was what allegedly happened in the hidden corners and private rooms that gave rise to the term freak-off. Allegations ranged from consensual adult escapades to far darker claims, suggesting that some guests were pressured or manipulated into compromising situations. For years, these stories were brushed aside, often dismissed as exaggerations or the bitter fallout of ex-insiders seeking attention. But once the girl began piecing together the truth, those rumors gained new weight. According to insiders who later spoke out, she had come across conversations and photographs that hinted at the unsettling side of these events. It wasn't immediately clear whether her discovery was accidental or something she actively pursued, but what she found deeply disturbed her. As her eventual testimony suggested, the timing of her adoption began to feel less like a benevolent act and more like a calculated move. Sources close to the situation alleged that her presence in Diddy's life may not have been purely coincidental. Whether it was her unassuming appearance, her vulnerability, or something more strategic, the idea began to take hold that she may have been brought into his world with a purpose. Certain text messages and personal accounts, later referenced in courtroom documents, implied that her adoption could have served a function related to these secretive gatherings. Although Diddy had faced scattered allegations over the years, the connection between his parties and the girl's sudden presence in his life added a chilling new layer of suspicion. The notion that someone so young and so far removed from this world could be pulled into its orbit drew widespread outrage and disbelief. Her own discovery of these events shook her to the core. As she began asking questions and eventually speaking out, the focus shifted, not just on the events themselves, but on the man behind them. Her testimony in court marked a turning point. For the first time, she was able to publicly share what she had seen, what she had learned, and how it had shaped her understanding of why she had been adopted in the first place. Her words didn't just challenge Diddy's motives, they exposed a narrative far darker than the public had ever imagined. And for many watching, it became clear, this wasn't just about one girl's adoption. It was about what her story had uncovered and the secrets it threatened to bring into the light.
The video that we shared and talked about together.
Eva Baroni Combs? Yes, it was breaking news. Diddy adopted a white child.
I was on the streets, and then Papa Combs.
I did some digging around and found some old photos that go back many years. She was with him when she was very, very young, so she is in fact his adopted daughter. Some are saying this woman in the background here is her mother, but nothing is confirmed. You can see she's been with him in interviews, hanging out with Diddy's daughters. She was seen everywhere with Diddy's daughter. Here's another one. And I mean, they go way back. And here's a few more. So it shows that, yes, indeed, they spent time together and they grew up together. This is in fact their sister and Diddy's adopted daughter. However, I found a video that is so suspect. I want you guys to check it out and tell me what you think.
This is my life.
I have a lot of cars now.
This is because I am a great father, but I'm sleeping with the girl. Tell me, who do y'all have a crush on? Tell Daddy the truth.
I don't know about you guys, but that video and the way Diddy's acting raises so many questions. So many are asking, where's Ava?
Courtroom was cloaked in heavy silence as she stepped onto the witness stand. Every sound, shuffling papers, whispered exchanges between attorneys, echoed louder under the immense tension. At the defense table, Diddy sat with his eyes fixed downward, refusing to meet her gaze. The gallery was packed, reporters with pens poised, onlookers holding their breath. Everyone knew this wouldn't be just another day in court. Including him. His trademark confidence had all but vanished, replaced by a haunted stillness as the weight of the moment bore down on him. She began her testimony with a steady voice, carefully avoiding eye contact with Diddy. At first, her statements painted a broad and almost detached picture of a young girl without direction, suddenly thrust into a world of luxury and celebrity. But the tone shifted quickly. She spoke of odd patterns she began noticing in the months following her adoption. Conversations that abruptly ended when she entered a room, subtle glances exchanged among staff, questions left unanswered when she asked about the infamous parties. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be a part of, she said, her voice clear but heavy with implication. The line sent a ripple through the courtroom. Then came the revelation that turned murmurs into stunned silence. She described the moment she stumbled upon what she called proof: photographs, guest lists she was never meant to see, and coded messages she could no longer ignore. Her words painted those secretive gatherings not as parties, but as controlled environments where power and indulgence ruled, and where darker dynamics often played out behind closed doors. I realized I wasn't just there for family reasons, she said, her voice cracking slightly. I was part of something I didn't understand. The courtroom reacted like a living thing. The judge leaned forward. Lawyers whispered with increasing urgency. Members of the gallery exchanged wide-eyed glances. What had once been mere speculation was now gaining the shape of something more concrete, her implication that the adoption itself had been strategic, not altruistic. It wasn't just me who noticed things, she continued. People who worked there tried to warn me. One of the most damning moments came when she recalled overhearing a conversation between Diddy and another high-profile figure. She didn't name the person, but said the discussion involved arranging new guests for the parties, phrased in language that left little room for innocence. At that point, Diddy finally looked up. His face twitched, his composure slipping as he leaned toward his attorney and whispered something through clenched teeth. But the moment that sent a shockwave through the courtroom was her assertion that the adoption may have served dual purposes: optics and access. She claimed her presence helped soften Diddy's public image, or worse, that it provided a shield, a kind of cover, granting him access to situations where lines could blur under the guise of protection. The accusation landed like a hammer. Diddy's legal team leapt to object, but the damage had been done. The judge called for an early recess. The gallery buzzed with disbelief as reporters rushed to file updates, cameras flashed, and phones lit up with breaking news alerts. She stepped down from the stand slowly, measured, without looking back. All eyes turned to Diddy, now frozen in place, his stillness a stark contrast to the chaos erupting around him. What she had delivered wasn't just testimony, it was a direct hit to his legacy. A public reckoning. And the worst part for Diddy was now unmistakable. This wasn't over.
On the witness stand about how Puff and her was in a freak-off, and then D-Rock intervened or whatever like that, and they masked themselves up in all black, took the guns out the safe, and went to find Suge. You know what I'm saying? Suge even spoke about he glad they didn't find him because a whole lot of other people would probably been dead then too, you know, if they would have found him. Now, she testified that, you know, Puff and D-Rock was going to try to, you know, unalive Suge. You know what I'm saying? Now, what I do know this, me and D-Rock had a conversation about why he's so close to Puff now. You understand? And he told me he was in a diner, Mel's Diner. I guess it was probably Mel's Diner. That's one of the diners that stay late open in California. He said that he was trapped in there and he ain't have no burners or nothing on him. He ain't have no guns, no nothing. He said he called Puff. Now, this is a story coming from D-Rock. He said he called Puff, and Puff came there. But if Puff would have came in the diner, they would have known something. He didn't come in the diner. He sent Cassie in there with the burners. And Cassie gave D-Rock the gun in the diner. Now, this is coming from D-Rock. The story Cassie told is that it was a whole different story from what D-Rock had told me, because D-Rock said he was in the diner himself. And Puff came down there with the guns, sent Cassie in there and gave him one, and was outside waiting on him to come outside. So that's the story that I knew, and I had already said that and expressed that in one of my shows before. Now, the story Cassie told, it was like she saw D-Rock and Puff both put on black and went to go unalive Suge. So those are two different stories that I know of. You know, one from D-Rock and the one we heard from Cassie. It may be the same story and Cassie just flipped it some kind of way. Because D-Rock told me this years ago. And then maybe Cassie just, flipped it in a certain kind of way because she took the gun to D-Rock.
The aftermath of her testimony sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom walls. Within hours, major news outlets seized on her statements, splashing the most explosive claims across headlines. What began as a quiet, complex case had erupted into a full-blown media firestorm, and the scrutiny around Diddy intensified with every passing minute. Her allegations weren't just about an adoption or murky motivations. They reached into the most protected corners of his life, challenging the glossy narrative he had so carefully built over decades. Social media ignited. Hashtags linked to Diddy's name trended for days, as users dissected every detail of the courtroom bombshell. While some fans defended him fiercely, many others expressed outrage, betrayal, and disbelief. Questions swirled around the secretive parties, the circumstances of the adoption, and what had really gone on behind the scenes of Diddy's empire. The story had become more than a scandal. It was now a symbol of the uneasy collision between power, fame, and secrecy. For Diddy, the legal implications were immediate and severe. Legal analysts began appearing on television and online platforms, breaking down how her testimony could trigger criminal investigations into his private dealings. Her claims, particularly those involving coercion, manipulation, and the misuse of power within elite circles, placed him at the heart of a storm far larger than a single court case. As one prominent attorney put it, if the evidence she described is substantiated, this opens the door to a series of very serious charges. It was no longer just about whether the adoption had been ethical. It was about what the entire situation might reveal about a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. Diddy's legal team reacted swiftly. That evening, they released a carefully worded statement categorically denying the allegations. They dismissed her testimony as a sensationalized distortion of the truth and portrayed Diddy as a misunderstood father figure whose intentions had been unfairly mischaracterized. Members of his inner circle echoed this narrative, with longtime associates insisting the accusations were fabricated, malicious attempts to tarnish his reputation. Still, one thing stood out. Diddy himself remained silent. In the wake of such a personal and public accusation, his absence only deepened the growing unease. No statement. No appearance. Just silence. Outside the courtroom, the fallout rippled into his career. Advertisers began pulling back. One major brand even announced a pause in their collaboration, pending further developments. Industry insiders whispered about deals on hold and partnerships in flux. For a man whose brand had long been inseparable from his identity as a mogul and cultural icon, the damage was real. This could fundamentally shift how people see him, one insider remarked. In his world, perception is everything. But the most pressing question remained: had her testimony provided enough for prosecutors to take further action? The answer was still unclear, but murmurs had begun. There were early signs of investigators digging deeper, looking for corroborating evidence, seeking out others who may have witnessed or experienced similar things. The possibility of new witnesses coming forward loomed large, adding pressure to a case that was rapidly snowballing into something bigger than anyone had anticipated. The court called for a formal review of her claims, signaling that the judge and prosecution were treating them with gravity. Whether this would result in additional charges or the unmasking of others within Diddy's circle was still unknown. But one thing was certain: the case had already changed everything. This wasn't just about one adoption. It wasn't just about one man's lifestyle. It was about power, the kind of power that thrives in secrecy, enabled by celebrity, and protected by silence. The revelations had peeled back the curtain on an industry that too often operates without accountability. Diddy's legacy, once defined by hustle, creativity, and influence, now carried the weight of something much darker. And as the world watched the walls begin to crumble, the bigger questions took center stage. How far can fame shield someone from consequences? And what happens when those shields finally fail? This case isn't just a scandal. It's a reckoning. Stay tuned. The story isn't over. And if justice is to mean anything, even in the brightest spotlight, it must shine in the darkest places, too.